Macro students, and welcome back to another AP Live instructional video. My name's Matt Romano, and today we are going to do another set of practice problems actually, and focusing on Unit 3. So Unit 3 was regarding national income and price determination. Ultimately, looking back on it now that you've been through everything, you know what the course looks like, and you've got a big picture view. You can see that Unit 3 was just all about ADAS, about building the ADAS model, building up an initial understanding of it. You now see it in a broader context, how it's right at the heart of everything else that we do within this course. So we built up ADAS analysis. We introduced the concepts of multipliers, just spending and tax multipliers. We didn't get the money multiplier yet, but the concept of a multiplier we did in Unit 3. We introduced fiscal policy. Stabilization policy in general was introduced here in Unit 3. And of course, along with that, talking about fiscal policy, we talked about automatic stabilizers as an option beyond just the standard discretionary stabilizers that we typically discuss. So that's what we're going to focus on throughout this lesson, and that's what we're going to look at primarily when we do a couple practice problems at the end of this lesson. What do you need to know? Well, again, briefly, because we've already covered all of this, we've done review videos. Let's talk about the big ideas, the essential questions that come from this unit on national income and price determination. And again, with the perspective you now have, looking back on a whole year's worth or a whole course's worth of AP Macro, you can read between the lines here and see exactly what they're talking about. First question, for example, how do spending and production decisions made by households, businesses, government, and the rest of the world affect an economy? In other words, how do we analyze an economy? How do we analyze the effects of changes in production levels, or what causes changes in production levels? What causes change in spending, and who's doing the spending? Well, obviously households, businesses, government, and the rest of the world. So it's a clear, really foreshadowing, if you're looking at this prior to the unit, it's a clear foreshadowing to aggregate demand, aggregate supply analysis, which is what you're going to do in this unit. And the second question is obviously about fiscal policy. How do policy decisions regarding taxation and government spending affect an economy? So again, you've been there, done that already. It's pretty clear that these are the overriding questions that you hope to answer through your study of ADAS and fiscal policy. Developing understanding starts out by talking about obviously Unit 2, where you talk about macro indicators, the major macro indicators, GDP, unemployment, inflation as represented by price level, changes in price level, and of course the business cycle. And we're making a connection here. We're making a connection between those three indicators and how we can demonstrate why those indicators change. And that's some of the most valuable lessons we can learn from using this ADAS analysis. Again, connecting the data to a picture. One thing I often say to my classes, for as many topics as possible, maybe all of them, you ought to be able to know them in numbers, words, and pictures. Okay, and a lot of times we start with the words. You have to understand the definitions of them. Then we have some data to back it up, which is what you did in Unit 2. The pictures are the graphs. And we use these graphs, ADAS in particular, for an entire macroeconomy, to make connections between the words and the numbers that we're learning and the actual effects that they have on an economy, the movements and the changes that occur, the fluctuations that occur within the business cycle. So this developing understanding statement says it right here. The ADAS model is a powerful tool that allows economists to represent the impact of spending and production decisions, economic fluctuations, and policy actions on macroeconomic outcomes, including output, income, unemployment, and inflation. So there it is right there. It's connecting the dots between the data from Unit 2 and all those economic goals and concepts that we've been talking about, the big picture of an economy. A lot of skills in Unit 3, a lot of skills, obviously. Yes, you have to describe economic concepts and use them to explain what's going on. You've got to determine the outcome of economic situations. You've got to determine the effect of a change in an economic situation using quantitative data and calculations. All of that's kind of a given. You know that you've got to know your concepts and principles. You've got to be able to explain them, and you've got to be able to use the numbers to explain them as well. Skills 4A, 4B, and 4C obviously are all related to drawing and demonstrating changes on graphs. These are skills that I know you've developed. Your teachers did a great job, I'm sure, of instructing you on this, on modeling it and having you practice it. But as you know, I want to point out that this year, this 1 year, you're not going to be drawing those graphs on the exam itself. So in our practice question today, we're going to draw graphs, and I encourage you that in all of your practice and all of your prep for the exam, continue to draw those graphs, but with the understanding that you're not going to do that on the exam itself, at least not on anything you submit. A reminder, it'd be a good idea to have some paper out when you're taking this exam, draw some graphs out on the scratch paper, help yourself answer questions using them, because that's what graphs are. They are tools that we can use to apply skills, to apply knowledge, to help us better understand what it is we're trying to see here. So again, everything in the red box, not going to be on the exam, but those are skills that you should have developed and you're going to use to help you answer questions. Essential graphs, well, this whole unit is about one graph. This one, the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So what can we say about it? We've really looked at it in great detail. We've practiced it a lot, and again, we're going to practice it more today. But this is a model you just have to know if you're going to be successful in macroeconomics at any level. You've got to know what this model is all about. Recall that we've talked a lot about using this model in the context of these types of free response questions. And the first thing you always want to do is you want to recognize what is the starting point. How does my current output level compare to full employment output? If it's drawn like we see right here, obviously we're operating at long run equilibrium. And when we operate at long run equilibrium, all three of those curves intersect at the same output level. And that output level is our full employment output level. It's the equivalent of operating on the PPC. It indicates that all of our resources are being utilized in a sustainable and efficient manner. It indicates that we're at the natural rate of unemployment. All of that is true at that point. The other two starting points, obviously, we could have output which is less than full employment, where Y is less than full employment, which is going to tell us that the unemployment rate is elevated. It's greater than the natural rate. And we have a recessionary gap. So that's, again, something we have to recognize. And we're going to practice how we read that within the context of an FRQ today. And of course, the third beginning point is output beyond full employment. We're utilizing resources to a point that is unsustainable. We're beyond the curve in this case. Unemployment is less than the natural rate. And we know what's going to happen as a result of that. We could have long-run self-correction where resource prices start to rise, or there could be a policy change that brings us back to full employment. Ultimately, we'll wind up back at full employment in the long run. The question always becomes, how do we get there? As far as those curves are concerned, remind yourself what's going to shift each curve. The short run aggregate supply curve, a simple question you can ask when you're given an example, this change in the economy, is it making production cheaper and easier, or is it making it more expensive and more difficult? If it's making it cheaper and easier to do business, now we've got to be looking from the producer perspective, but if it makes it cheaper, if it makes it easier to do business, input prices are falling, regulations are lifted, then we're going to shift SRAS to the right. If it makes it more expensive, makes it more difficult, production costs are rising, imposition of taxes on businesses, any of that kind of stuff, SRAS is going to shift to the left. So keep that clear in your mind. Aggregate demand, we've done this so much. I know you know it by now. The four shifters of aggregate demand: changes in consumer spending, investment spending, government purchases, net export spending. We've got to always keep that in mind. We've got to be on the lookout for them. When you're given a question and it pertains to aggregate demand, or you don't know what it pertains to yet, run through that checklist. When you're given an example, is it consumption? Is it investment? Is it government spending? Is it net exports? If it is, we shift aggregate demand. And if any of those increase, any type of spending increases, AD shifts to the right. If any of those decrease, AD shifts left. If it's not one of those four things, AD is not shifting. It really is that simple. So keep it as simple as possible. We have to know why those things will change, but keep it as simple as possible. Bring it back to CI, G, and X, because those are your shifters of the aggregate demand curve. Formulas. So we have to know numbers. I already said graphs or pictures. Now we need to know the numbers as well. Multipliers. We did introduce the multiplier effect, and we use the multiplier effect by applying the lessons of MPC and MPS. And we try to determine the potential changes in output that occur due to changes in spending and or taxes. And those can be any kind of spending. Sometimes we get locked in on just one type of spending when we're using multipliers. It's not just government spending. It could be investment spending, net export spending. We're just trying to predict, based upon the marginal propensity to consume, We're trying to predict how much of a change in output could potentially occur as a result of the multiplier effect. In order to calculate, we should know the spending multiplier is 1 over 1 minus MPC, or an equivalent fraction 1 over MPS, because MPC plus MPS equals 1. How do we use that? To calculate any change in output, I just take a change in spending. In this case, I put change in government spending, but it could be investment spending, net export spending. I take a change in spending and I multiply it by that spending multiplier. And that's going to tell me, if we have the full multiplier effect, this would be the predicted change in output. The tax multiplier, we need to know that as well for changes in taxes. Tax multiplier is negative MPC over 1 minus MPC, or equivalent fraction negative MPC over MPS. We use it in the same way. The change in output is going to be the change in taxes times the tax multiplier. So whatever that lump sum change in taxes is, it doesn't work for per unit. We have to have a lump sum. Whatever that lump sum change in taxes is, we simply multiply it by the tax multiplier and we find our potential change in output. Note that it's a negative number because increases in taxes are going to reduce disposable income. They're going to reduce spending. So they're going to work in opposite directions. We have this inverse relationship, and that's what that negative number is going to indicate. Note that it's always a smaller number. The tax multiplier is always less than the spending multiplier. Through this equation, it's actually 1 less in magnitude and negative. That's always the case. That could be important on an FRQ. It could be important on an FRQ today that we practice. So always keep that in mind, that the magnitude of the spending multiplier is greater. Why is that? I know we've been over it already, but fact of the matter is, if let's just say it's government spending, once that money is spent, it's out there. But in the case of taxes, if there were, say, a reduction in tax rates, some of that reduction in tax rates is going to be saved. It will not be spent. And that's why we try to represent the tax multiplier as a smaller number in terms of the magnitude and the overall impact it's going to have on total output. Okay. All that said, that goes really fast going backwards, looking backwards on it. When you did it in class, when you did it the first time, when you were in class doing Unit 3, it probably took you a few weeks to do all that material because you have to build so much. But now looking back, it's all in one piece, and hopefully that one piece makes sense to you. So we're going to go into guided practice here. We're going to do 2 questions on from previous AP exams. I think it's safe to say this is just a statement of fact. This is not a prediction. Be sure you understand that, but a statement of fact that ADAS is the most commonly asked topic of all topics in AP Macro. So it's very easy to find questions that include ADAS. Not common that you get one that's exclusively ADAS, which should also make sense because it's connected to everything we do here. But almost any year you can pick at random, there's going to be a question in there with ADAS on it. I can't think of a year where there wasn't. There could have been, but I can't think of one. So a lot of questions to choose from. If you want to go back to AP Central and practice a few on your own, that'd be a great idea. You're going to have plenty where you can practice working with the ADAS model. But I chose 2 because I felt like they did a nice job of highlighting the concepts that we just went over. They're going to make you do the graph itself, make you think through the shifters of ADAS, make you think through fiscal policy and multipliers as well. So let's jump into it. Now, if you're watching this recorded, obviously now would be the time to go ahead and press pause, work your way through the problem, and then come back and we'll go over the answers. Those watching live right now, I'm going to pause a little bit as we go, but we're going to work our way through the question as we go and go through the question and answers. So here we have a question from 2015 Q1. Starts out by telling us, assume the U.S. economy is operating below full employment. And I'm going to remind you again, there's always something in that first sentence that we're going to need down the line. Should be pretty clear what we're going to need. They're going to ask you to draw ADAS. You've got to draw it. You've got to draw it correctly. Now, of course, this year that doesn't apply, but this is still good practice because you get in the habit of knowing what goes where and what it represents. This jumps into monetary policy a little bit, parts B and C. I realize we're not there yet. We're in Unit 3, but we're going to go ahead and look at the answer to this because, again, we're looking backwards. You know what monetary policy is. And then D jumps into fiscal policy and jumps into the multiplier effect. So we'll take our time there and make sure that makes sense. And then finally, E is going to talk about the effects of the change in taxes and how that impacts the ADAS model. So let's jump into question 1A. Draw a correctly labeled graph of the long-run aggregate supply, short-run aggregate supply, and aggregate demand, and show each of the following. Current equilibrium output and price level, labeled as Y1, PL1. Full employment output labeled as YF. Okay, so we're going to draw this graph. What do I need to do to draw it correctly? Well, obviously I need to know my axes, price level, real GDP. Got to put my curves, downward sloping AD, upward sloping SRAS, but I've got to include LRAS and YF, and I've got to know where that goes, and that's step one. It's right there in our opening sentence. Again, one of the biggest mistakes a lot of students make is maybe they get worried about time, maybe they're just rushing to get to the answer, but they don't fully read the question. And they're telling us right off the bat, the economy is operating below full employment. That's going to tell me how I'm going to draw my graph. Now I follow directions. And when I do so, this is the result. You've got price level on the Y, real GDP on the X, PL1 and Y1, where SRAS and AD intersect, and that Y1 is less than YF. So if you've drawn a graph like this, then you earn 2 points. You've earned all possible points. Okay, again, this is a case where we can follow directions, and if we read carefully and we know what to look for, we're going to do just fine. Okay, on to part B and C. These two go together, and again, they're monetary policy, which is not covered in Unit 3, but we're going to talk about them anyway because it helps to see them in the context of the big picture and the question itself. Assume the Federal Reserve targets a new Fed funds rate to reach full employment. Should the Federal Reserve target a higher or lower federal funds rate? Then C, which goes along with it, given the Federal Reserve action you identified in Part B, draw a correctly labeled graph of the money market, show the effect on the nominal interest rate. All right. The question's then asking what would be the proper stabilization policy for the Fed to implement right now? If we're operating below full employment, we need an expansionary policy, but that doesn't answer the question. Which of these options is expansionary? That would be a lower federal funds rate. So again, in this case, all you have to do is say lower federal funds rate. You're not asked for an explanation or anything else, just say lower federal funds rate. How do we show that on the graph of the money market? Nominal interest rates on the y-axis, quantity of money on the x. We have a vertical money supply curve, downward sloping money demand, and money supply is going to increase. It's expansionary monetary policy will expand the monetary base, expand the overall money supply. We shift money supply to the right, and we show that real interest rates have fallen from R1 to R2. All right. Moving on to Part D. Policymakers pursue a fiscal policy rather than a monetary policy in Part B. Assume the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8. The value of the recessionary gap is $300 billion. Now, if you're taking this exam, if you're answering this question, I'm writing some information down or I'm highlighting it. What do I need from this one? What do I pull from this question? I'm going to need the MPC. Might not be a bad idea to also write down your MPS is 0.2. I need to know that recessionary gap is $300 billion. We're operating, in this case, we're operating $300 billion below full employment. D1, if the government changes its spending without changing taxes to eliminate the recessionary gap, calculate the minimum required change in government spending. Okay, so we're applying a fiscal policy. We're not going to change taxes. We want to close a $300 billion gap. Well, do we increase spending by $300 billion? No, of course not. We know there's a multiplier effect. We know that all money spent is received by someone and they're going to spend a portion of it. In this case, they're going to spend 80% of every dollar they earn, every additional dollar they earn, I should say. Therefore, we need to use that multiplier. The multiplier in this case, multiplier is 5. 1 over 0.2 is 5, which means that any amount of spending will be multiplied by 5 when we try to determine the final result of it. And this is a good way of looking at policy and how policy decisions would be made. To get that answer then, we just take that $300 billion divided by 5, and you get $60 billion. The change in government spending would be $60 billion. If the government changes taxes without changing government spending to eliminate the recessionary gap, will the minimum required change in taxes be greater than, smaller than, or equal to the minimum required change in government spending in Part D1? Explain. What is this question asking? It's asking us to evaluate the relative magnitude of the spending multiplier and the tax multiplier. So the answer, 2 parts because we have an explained portion to this one. 1 point earned for stating the minimum required change in taxes will be greater than the minimum required change in government spending. Could you just calculate it and tell us the answer that way? Yes, you could. You could tell us that 75 is greater than 60, but you do still have to explain. 1 point is earned for explaining the tax multiplier is smaller than the government spending multiplier because part of that initial increase in disposable income caused by the decrease in income taxes will be saved rather than spent. That explanation, what we gave a little bit earlier today, is the exact reason why we have a smaller tax multiplier and why you would have to reduce taxes by 75 as opposed to increasing spending by 60. As a reminder, remember, you have to show your work. And this is an example from the rubric here, from the scoring guidelines of how you can show your work. Set up your equation, show what numbers you used and how you use them to get your final answer. But don't forget to show your work when you do these questions. All right, finally, part E. Part E asks us, assume the government lowers income tax rates to eliminate the recessionary gap. Will each of the following increase, decrease, or stay the same? Aggregate demand, explain. Long run aggregate supply, explain. All right, this is a tough one. We have to, again, make connections. 1 point earned for stating aggregate demand will increase, and there's explain. We have to explaining that lower income tax rates will increase disposable income and or consumption and investment. So AD increases because of a decrease in taxes, increase in disposable income. That's pretty straightforward, but what about LRAS? This is very unique. It's not often this happens, but the way the question was asked, there's no reference to any time horizon. We don't know if we're talking long run or short run. So the question becomes, what do we do with LRAS? The intention was to ask about the short run because nothing's stated here. So in the short run, the change in tax is not going to have an impact on LRAS. And that's what the first, I'd say bullet point, but there's only one bullet point for it. The first sentence here in the bullet point says 1 point earned for stating that LRAS will stay the same because lowering income taxes will increase consumption and investment. There's no change in inputs. There's no change in productivity in the short run. But if we extend our analysis to the long run, you can give a logically accurate answer and still earn credit for it, even though it didn't match maybe the initial intent. So you could also have said 1 point is earned for stating that long run aggregate supply will increase in the long run because lowering taxes will increase savings and investment in physical capital, or because of increased incentives to work. So if you're making that connection because of increases in productivity, increases in capital accumulation or capital stock, then you could make that connection and argue that yes, LRAS will shift to the right. Or because now we're dealing with a deficit, you could go with this third option, 1 point earned for saying that long run aggregate supply will decrease in the long run because lowering taxes leads to a crowding out of private investment. That reduction in private investment is going to reduce capital formation, reduce productivity, shift LRAS to the left. That's rare that would happen, but it can happen. Point being, if you provide logically accurate answers that answer the question that was asked, you should earn credit for representing that. All right, let's jump to our second question. 2012, question 3. So this is considered a short free response question. The first one was a long free response question. If you've looked at the details of the 2020 exam, the first question is going to be a combination of 2 short questions. This is 1 short question, so you can expect something like this, but 2 of them put together, whereas the second question is meant to represent FRQ 1 from most years, the one we just did. All right, so in terms of just length of question, that's what you can expect. Look at number 3. Assume the economy of Anderson Land is in a long-run equilibrium with full employment. In the short run, nominal wages are fixed. That's something we should know, but they're going to reiterate that for us. Again, statement like that is likely going to be something that we need to use. You might want to jot it down, highlight it, make a note of it somewhere. All right, if you're watching recorded, again, right now, pause it, take your time, answer the question, come right back on and we will go over those answers. All right, let's talk about part A. Draw a correctly labeled graph of the short run aggregate supply, long run aggregate supply, and aggregate demand. Show each of the following: equilibrium output, Y1, equilibrium price level, PL1. Okay, once again, when we're drawing this and we're including, obviously, LRAS, we need to know how does output compare to full employment. There it is. It's right there in the question. We're in a long run equilibrium with full employment. They basically told you twice what it's supposed to look like. So your answer? Price level on the y-axis, real GDP on the x, PL1, Y1 at long run equilibrium. That gets you the first point. LRAS running right through that intersection of SRAS and AD. Now, this graph, this is taken directly from the scoring guidelines. The graph itself shows the answer to part B, which we're about to discuss. So the increase that you see here in AD is not related to part A. We're going to come back to that in just a moment. So part B, speaking of, assume there's an increase in exports from Anderson land. On your graph in part A, show the effect of higher exports on the equilibrium in the short run, labeling new equilibrium output and price level Y2 and PL2 respectively. So that's what we saw here. The increase in AD because of an increase in exports is going to cause increase in price level and an increase in output. So the explanation, which you didn't have to give, but which is given in the scoring guidelines, 1 point earned for showing a rightward shift of AD and showing Y2 and PL2. Part C, based on your answer in part B, what is the impact of higher exports on real wages in the short run? Explain. All right, we have to be consistent with whatever was said in part B. The correct answer for part B showed an increase in aggregate demand, increase in price level, increase in output. How do I connect that to a change in real wages? We're dealing with the short run, and you may have noted the initial sentence told us something about the short run. Nominal wages are fixed. That's my clue. That's my hint. I've got to use that information. To answer correctly, 1 point is earned for stating that real wages will fall because price level is increased, nominal wages in the fixed run are fixed in the short run. Something you can take from this. When you see the word explain in a question, the word because should fit in your answer. You may or may not use it, but it should fit. So that's another hint. That's another really test-taking tip that you can use. If the question says explain, I'm going to state some answer, some assertion, and then I've got to say because this is what happened. Remember, you're trying to identify a causal relationship in these types of questions. All right, almost forgot. Let's back up and think about this. Nominal wages aren't changing. Nominal wages are what we're actually being paid. That's what the workers themselves are being paid, current dollar values. They're not changing, but everything's getting more expensive. Price levels going up. So the real wage, when we consider the effects of inflation, the real wage itself, the purchasing power of those wages, it's gone down. And that's why that's the correct answer to C. Finally, part D, as a result of the increase in exports, export-oriented industries in Anderson land increase expenditures on new container ships and equipment. What component of aggregate demand will change? Interesting question there. So what are the components of aggregate demand? C, I, G, and X, we know that. We want to narrow in on which one of those four is going to change because of this example. Read it again. As a result of the increase in exports, export-oriented industries in Anderson land increase expenditures. So who's spending money here? Export-oriented industries. Where does that fit in the context of aggregate demand? It's not consumption. It's not government. It's not net exports. This is because of net exports. It's industries. That's investment spending. All right. So we've got to connect the dots there. 1 point's going to be earned for saying the investment component of AD will change. And then for part two of D, what's the impact on long-run aggregate supply? Explain. Now we've got to make a connection between a change in investment spending and long-run aggregate supply economic growth. So your correct answer, 1 point earned for stating LRAS will shift to the right because, there's that word again, because capital stock has increased. Capital formation has increased. Capital accumulation has occurred. There's a development of new capital stock. Any of those things are going to apply because what's happening here, industries are spending money on new capital, and that's going to increase productivity, shift LRAS out to the right. Okay, that's your question. So unit 3, as we said, unit 3 is primarily about building the ADAS model, starting to put it into context, connecting it to fiscal policy, also connecting it obviously to the economic data that you studied in unit 2. But really it's about building that understanding of ADAS, knowing that it's right there at the heart of everything in AP Macro, and that we've got to be able to use it to explain what's happening, why things are changing in a macro economy. I hope that was helpful. I want to remind you once again that there are tools on AP Classroom, new tools on AP Classroom just recently added to help you prepare for the upcoming exam. Log on to AP Classroom, go to this page and find those practice exam questions so you can get yourself as prepared as possible, because you deserve that opportunity to show what you have learned, and we hope you do that. And with that, I want to thank you for watching once again, and I hope you come back and watch us again. And my best to you and yours. I hope all is well. Thanks a lot.